Hello and welcome to the Alastair Greener Generationally Speaking podcast, where we look at bridging the generation gap by debunking myths, tackling stereotypes, and sharing practical tips on how we can build stronger intergenerational connections. Now, today, I'm talking to someone who has lived and worked literally all over the world. She's currently an independent consultant specializing in unattended retailing. Graduating with an engineering degree, her career spans private and public companies, sprinkled with a side hustle of fitness coaching and a lot of volunteering. Gillian White, good morning.
Good morning, Alastair. Thanks for having me on the podcast.
It's great to talk to you, and it's going to be fun because I think you're not going to let me get away with anything, which is great.
Absolutely not. Nor you me.
Now,
So
whether that's indicative of your generation or not, I don't know. And I'm going to start off by just telling everyone that you are a Gen X cusper. So you're close to the cusp of being a boomer, which basically means Gen X were born between 1965 and 1980. And of course, boomers before that. So first of all, would you say that you are fairly typical of your generation when you look at the traits of a typical Gen X? Do you fit in with that, do you think?
Well, I'm going to say I fit in with me because I get quite bothered by this whole absolutes of generations. Clearly, there are differences because lived experience is going to be different. You know, chronological age is something you can't do anything about. So there are probably things that I do where someone would say, "Oh, you're a typical Gen Xer," and I'll use the. But I like to think that I'm a bit more spread out just from my background and my education and also what I think and how I lead my life.
One of the phrases that I use a lot is that we're framed by our generation and not defined by it. So what framed you growing up? What made you, do you think?
I think a childhood of moving around, so different geographies and obviously therefore locations. And I think that because of that, I was always having to be the new kid and learn new ways of doing things in new cultures, potentially new languages. And I think that made me think differently about how I operate. And I think the stereotypes that we talk about are about how we operate in day-to-day society. And what, so I'm informed by a broad childhood, but I can't help that I was born when I was, and therefore I may make references to things that were different, maybe whether that's radio or TV, British Forces Radio, that's, so that might not mean anything to someone who's never been in that situation. So I think it's situationally driven, and I think it's individually driven. But sure, there'll be things I probably just don't want to admit it because I have a real problem with aging. As you know, you and I have discussed that. And labels associated with someone's this old, therefore they do this. It really grinds my gears, I'm afraid.
And it's an interesting topic, that whole thing of people being defined by, as you say, their age or stages of life and so on, because one word which I know you hate is retirement, because it's a definitive word. But what's interesting about it, you look at your age, there are people your age who are already, should we say, out of the workplace rather than retired. So why do you have an issue with that sort of terminology? Is it because you don't want to confront it, or is it because you just think it's too linear?
I think it's too linear. And I also honestly, age is a privilege. So there are people that I went to school with that I know, they're no longer with us. And because an age doesn't define that you can't do things that other people of other ages do. And I think it limits how we interact with each other. If you dismiss someone rather than exploring what can they do and just say that they're this age, then they're retired and they're not interested, you can become invisible. And I think for me, one of the biggest issues, both with retirement and also the stereotyping, is it's actually just ageism. And I just really struggle with that because people can be ageist for young people. I mean, I'm not talking that it's not defined to retirement, but I really hate it because I think it says you are redundant, useless. I'm not, you have no value. And I actually think absolutely not the case. And I shall tell you a short story, if I may. I had the privilege this week of going for a walk at Wisley with an emeritus professor of physics who has done amazing things in the world of lasers, in which we haven't in our house. And he's 85 and still giving lectures and still as bright as a button. And yeah, he can't walk as quickly as he did. But so he is retired. But, you know, that's what I aspire to. I think never give up. For me, retirement says give up. Now, maybe I'm overinterpreting it. Could be me. But that's my real issue with it.
But you're absolutely right in that labels and names do give a perception to people of what that means. And I think today we are seeing far more blurring of the lines, which is counterintuitive for a lot of people who want to have a very neat little box to put us all into. Yeah. And the reality is that if you look at your parents at your age, they were very different to the way you are. And the chances are that when Gen Z gets to your age, they will interpret that age in a very different way.
Yes, absolutely. And I think it is all about, you're right, that word interpretation. How do you want to be? How do you want the world to perceive you? And more importantly, how do you want to perceive yourself? I want, you know, I'm fit, I'm active, I'm healthy, I'm probably lucky genetically. There's an element of that. But that's how I want to be seen. I want to be seen as adding value, having an opinion, having some historical reference that maybe you can share and, you know, learn towards younger generations, but also learn from older. I think it's about that being open. I find that the stereotyping, it's like, you know, all of the other HR or psychological tools can be a bit limiting. And if you wear that label at your peril, I think, and people use it as a defense mechanism. I'm this and I'm that. And obviously comedians use the generations as a bit of shtick, and it's, you know, it gets a laugh. But the trouble when it goes from being a laugh to being used against you, we should never do.
Yeah, because it becomes a judgmental tool if we're not careful, because
yes.
we see a stereotype in a certain way. And one of the things that I love about this podcast is not only do I get to talk to people from literally a multitude of backgrounds and also age ranges, but also that I know my audience comes from multiple age ranges as well. And one of the things I love to do is to help my guests show the audience who they are and the kind of world they grew up in, so that hopefully other people will understand them a little bit better. And that was my sort of clunky way to get round to your upbringing, because for your generation, being an engineer and being a female engineer, that wasn't a particularly common thing. So could you tell me a little bit about that and what it was like growing up in engineering, you know, at university and then the beginning of your career, and how you coped with, let's be honest, probably a little bit of prejudice?
Yeah, absolutely. So I wanted to do something in the sort of, you know, science, math world. And at the time, there was a drive, and probably there still is, to get women to consider engineering, because there are many types of engineering. It's not, you know. And so I did that. There were there were about 5 of us in the cohort I was in, and across the mechanical materials engineering, I think I was probably 120. So we were in the minority. And I suppose there's part of me that's like, I'm going to do, you know, why not? Why not? And I would say that to anyone considering a career that's maybe not classic. Why not? Go and do it. Give it a try, because the worst that can happen is you go and do something else. And so it was great fun. Yes, there was prejudice, but I think because there were a few of us, we were able to sort of support each other. And in some ways, the best way to overcome the prejudice is just to ignore it. Because if someone's going to think I'm a stupid idiot, whatever term, they're going to think it anyway. So my job is just to get my head down, do the work, and, you know, go through the rituals, you know, getting a long wait when you're an intern at somewhere, and, you know, all that nonsense, and just riding with it. And I think what helped was because I had been in experiences where I was the new kid in the class with moving around different countries. I found it easier, because by then you just, you know, you're 18, 19, 20, and you've kind of had those awkward moments, and you think, whatever, you know, and reflecting back on it, that's just how I dealt with it. I ignored it. Like, because they're going to think that anyway. You're a woman, you can't do this. Yeah, think that. Move on.
That's exactly what I was going to bring up next, actually, was how you overcame that inequality. You know, we hear often that women, especially in engineering and in industries where the women aren't as prevalent, you almost have to be better than men to get that same level. Was that something you experienced?
Yes, it is. And you just have to constantly prove it. And you have to prove it more often. But then when you do prove it, that's sort of the penny drops. And gradually people see that, you know, it's however you present is irrelevant to the outcome. But you have just got to be you just got to be very gritty, I suppose. Resilient is another word for it. And just, yeah, it will bother you, but you have then got to sort of scrunch it up, throw it over your shoulder and figure that you can't change. What other people think of me is none of my business. And you have to adopt that. Even though it's hard and at times you won't get it right, you will feel it's dreadful, but, you know, and then take that into the workplace and do the same, you know, because you've just got to face into it. There are people who will just think you're not very good. And if you know you are, you've just got to carry on and prove it, you know, again and again. A previous guest that I chatted to and I reference a lot is Dr. Linda Shaw, who's a neuroscientist, and she talks a lot about unconscious bias, and that's the whole point. It's unconscious. And, you know, one of the things that, in a sense, you have an advantage at your age is that you've experienced generational bias at both ends. Yes. So you obviously experienced it not only being female, being a young engineer. You will have had, I'm sure, the patronizing, you know, methodologies towards you and way people dealt with you. And now you might have from younger people some generation bias. So let's first of all talk about when you were younger, that generational bias, and then we'll talk about maybe any that you're experiencing now. So what was it like, you know, going through that as a young female engineer? Well, people just not believing you could do it and you knowing you could because you've got the same tools and equipment, and then just having to keep constantly battling through and proving the point and not being, you know, I suppose being a bit of an awkward cuss and not being willing to give up on that, and realizing that it was almost because I wanted to prove that I could do it. And the more people were against me, the more that made me want to show that I could do it. And then I got involved with, you know, women in engineering activities and outreach, which were going on, obviously, to try and get more women into the industry. And so I took it and used it as a tool to say, look, forget all that and try and encourage those coming up to, you know, if that's what you want to do and you're good at it, then give it a go. Why not? You know? And then in the workplace, same thing. And then I did some work in Japan. So you've got female, you've got, you know, Western and an engineer. So the whole thing. And again, having the belief in yourself, not cockiness, but the belief that you can do this, and having a support network around you that's like, yeah, you can do that. And that very much from my father, who was like, you know, who was even more old school, but, you know, because I was his daughter, and same with my sister, because she's my daughter, she's going to be able to do that, even if you don't think that's what girls should do. So really bizarre. And again, counterintuitive, you know.
How about the organisations? Were they supportive of you?
I was hugely lucky. Yes. I was hugely lucky in my first role when I moved to the US with a US company, and I had a very forward-thinking manager who was really, you know, very supportive of my career, made sure that I was getting all the professional development and encouraging me. And I think because he had two young daughters himself, he was sort of seeing, if I can do this for someone in my team, then this is the world I want the next generation to come into. I was just lucky, I think. And then when I moved back to the UK, equally lucky that I moved to organisations that understood the power of all the different skills that people bring, you know, whether you want to call it diversity or whatever term you want to use, the power of many and different skills and opportunities to get best results and irrelevant of, you know, background.
And you're probably going to hate this, but it's also fairly indicative of your generation, that level of resilience that Gen Xs are known for. And as you've already said, that resilience came maybe because of the era in which you were brought up, but also your personal circumstances possibly enhanced that level of resilience.
Yeah. To be honest, I wouldn't want to be a teenager right now. I think the world, we didn't have social media and stuff like that. And, it's not all, absolutely not rose-tinted glasses. Many things were great, but many things, it was just complicated to get things done. I mean, letters, wait for things in the post. But I think that you're right, the background and the timing, I think we had that opportunity, and we didn't have as much of the sort of social competitiveness and fears that people have now. And, it's very much, that's why I say lived experience is one thing and you can benefit from that. And then you have to learn how to adapt as things change. So, yeah, I think you're right. And I think part of that's just me, a little bit, not bloody minded, but, I want to be able to do things. I want to have the opportunities other people should. I want to get on and do things and able to have that internally. I think that's just in me. And it hasn't always been easy. I mean, I'm making it sound like it has, but obviously it hasn't. There have been many heads and hands, But actually, I think I do benefit from that.
We will come to this in a second because you've got a Zennial daughter. So yes. She's on the cusp between millennial and Gen Z. So I definitely want to come back to that in a moment in terms of comparisons. But let's just finish off that whole thought of generational bias. Now, as an independent business consultant, are you experiencing that at all when we see in industry the major decision makers are now, millennials and therefore quite a bit younger than you? Are you seeing any form of generation bias in the other direction?
I don't see it, but then I wouldn't work with someone who treated me like that. I would. Okay. I'm in that position where I'm in. I've got knowledge in an industry, so I can choose, and I will choose to work with people that respect across the piece. They respect you for knowledge and approach and input rather than judging a book by its cover. I just wouldn't work with them. But I'm very lucky, and I do understand my privilege because not everyone can do that. And yeah, I'm sure if I were in a different place and I was working in a business and that was, there was challenge or I didn't feel comfortable, I'd probably just leave, to be honest, to go and do something else.
But how would you navigate it if it was kind of like borderline? So in other words, it was a client you really were keen to work with, the project looked really exciting, you thought, great, but there was a little bit of that bias going on and you made a judgment call to say, actually, you know what, I'm going to give this a go because this is worth it. How would you go about then navigating that potential slight generational bias that you might experience? How would you steer around that?
I think you've got to get into the open, honest feedback, how this makes me feel and get into that conversation and, sort of arbitrate or mediate to find a way of working, because you can't change what someone thinks or their influences nor mine. So what you've got to do is actually be honest about how you can make something work for the good of the project, the good of the business, the good of the opportunity. And if you can't, I think then it's my choice would be to walk away, because there's only so many times, it's the Einstein, keep doing the same thing. If someone is so entrenched that you cannot change them, then I think time to move and find something different. But give them that feedback, because I think we only learn by being exposed to, the good and the bad of the things that we bring. That's how I would do it.
And that's the advantage.
I would be uncomfortable on both sides, I'm sure, but I'm not frightened of doing that,
But as I said, it's one of those things that the younger generation generally, they're more in that framework of communication, of feedback and discussion, where maybe when you were entering the engineering world, if you tried to do that then, you would have been shut down and closed off and get on with it.
Yes. Yeah, I think you're right. And I think you had to learn a different set of navigation skills, because in that circumstance, because if people were more closed, right? I think the world of work has improved in that sense, that there are now reviews and feedback and opportunities. It's not perfect, obviously, but I think there's more willingness to have difficult conversations. And I think that's absolutely key to it. Whether it's about how someone speaks or addresses you or and be willing to learn. I think I've got to be willing to learn. Other people have. It's both ways. You can't just stop and become so stuck in, I've always done it this way. It's always been this way. That just, everything evolves. Language, ways of working, how you solve problems, that's, for me, really important.
And that's one of the challenges for some fellow Gen Xers, that maybe they are a little bit more entrenched in their ways and don't have that level of flexibility. How would you suggest to somebody who maybe does struggle a little bit with the new ways of working, what kind of things would you suggest to them? And maybe you encounter them in your work and you want to help them because you like them, but you know that they're not maybe as with the program, shall we say, as they should be.
I think that's where coaching and mentoring comes in. I think that's hugely important. If you've got someone that's talented but sort of stuck behaviorally, just trying to coach them through that and do it in a way that doesn't sort of take from their skills, but allows them to perhaps see it from someone else's viewpoint. I mean, I must admit, we live near a sixth form college, and there are days when it's absolute mayhem. And then I think, now, what was I like when I was 18? and you have to kind of ask yourself, and I think if someone is stuck, and maybe try and help them to see it from the other side, try and understand why that's causing friction or tension or a difficulty, and then try and sort of almost workshop it, and help provide strategies. So my strategy is to take a breath. Was I like that, whatever age? And okay, I can translate, because it's easy to get riled up about things. And I think that's how I would do it. So, getting with someone, saying, look, I saw you do this. Would you like to discuss how maybe that could have gone better, without slapping them in the face, but actually honestly. And if they're not willing, then I think, you have to read that signal. But yeah, and I think it's a shame. I think that's what probably does drive this perception of the different generations and the sort of the intransigence, because people can almost give up and say, well, I'm not changing. It's down to someone else. And I think that's a dangerous place to be.
And it'll be interesting to see how the next generation, how they deal with it when they get to, the sort of older age and, at a different stage of their lives. But I want to come back to your daughter. She's a Xennial, and make the comparison a little bit maybe of how you were brought up and what aspirations you had for her in the way that you were going to bring her up, whether you were going to replicate the parenting that you received or whether you made a conscious decision, no, I'm going to do something a little bit differently. What was that sort of process for you?
I think I was going to be a little less strict because, military and, whatever generation my parents were together, the schools I went to, I wanted to be slightly less strict, but I also key thing for me is aspiration. I don't care what the aspiration is, but I think it's really important that you create an environment to go as far as you can and find what you're good at and really, really pursue it and never give up on something. And if someone has an ambition, it's like an itch, scratch it and then really see if you can go there. So a little bit kinder, probably a little bit more frantic because obviously, working parents, traveling, all that kind of stuff, and relying on other people. But always trying to keep an open mind as well about the big wide world and do travel and experience things. So I think those are the two things. Slightly kinder and definitely keep with the aspiration, and why not? Just that's,
And it's always very easy to look in the rearview mirror and think, okay, this happened, that happened, what would I have done differently? And so on. And because when you're there in the moment, you just do your best and you just do what you can. Looking back at the way millennials and Xennials were brought up, is there anything that you might have changed, or do you think society could have done a little bit differently for that age group?
I think I don't know if the word, I think the whole paranoia about safety and other people, you've got to create enough common sense and rules and strategies that you take care. But I think in some ways, sometimes it just goes too far, and that sort of whole learning to take risks, but learn from them. I think that potentially, and it's always a conundrum for me, because I look and people moan about the anxious generation, all that kind of stuff. Moan is, I use the term generally, but we were the people that brought them up. So we have no right to, we were their influence, we were their older influences. And I think that for me is just, have we lost the careful risk taking, if you know what I mean? And perhaps that's the one thing I think maybe is missing,
And of course, it's all very well saying it, but when you're caught up in the moment and that's what everybody else is doing, it's just learning from that. And actually, I read a report the other day about Gen Alpha, and of course, their parents are millennials and older Gen Zs, and how they're being a little bit different in the way that they're bringing up their children based on how they were brought up. And that's what happens, isn't it?
Yes.
Because I'm sure that your parents had a view on the way that you were bringing up your daughter.
Absolutely. And I think it flip-flops. There's a little bit of, you take the bits that perhaps are good, and then you think, well, I like that. Like I say, if you've got very strict parents, you're probably going to be a little bit more, because come on, and so I do think it, and then it goes round, because, and circumstances change, and obviously everything around us has changed in that time as well. So, yeah.
You've got a huge amount of experience in business. You've travelled. You've done some amazing things within your career. And looking at other people, first of all, for people who are maybe at your stage of your life, shall I say, without using any other words that might be cliched, what advice would you give to others in terms of navigating the workplace, being a very different place than it once was, and going forward? And, as you said before, you don't have any intention to slow down massively anytime soon. So what kind of advice do you have to people of your similar age of how to navigate that best?
Great question. I think there's two things. If you want to stay within, working in employment of some sort, then just staying relevant, making sure it's right for you, but also, and being a little bit humble, not in the macabre sense of the word, but realizing that maybe it's okay. You're probably going to be managed potentially by someone of a different generation, and that's fine. But be generous with the knowledge you have that can help someone who's coming up through their career. And if it's right for you not to be working and to do other things, voluntary things, that's still working, then just make it right for you. Be comfortable with where you're at. I'm uncomfortable with being perceived as being, out in the long grass and of no value. So I would say be honest about what you are, if you're well, and what interests you. And if you're lucky enough to work and you can go and do whatever you do, holidays or whatever, then that's great. But be honest about it, and don't feel guilty whatever decision you make. Your decision is entirely personal. And mine is to carry on working and being relevant. If you're going to stay in the workplace, be relevant, get on some courses and learn about AI or other skills or whatever. I'm not saying people don't, but I think it's really important that you continue to learn, be relevant and add the value. Otherwise, you will potentially be that person that gets pushed out into the long grass.
And actually, you mentioned AI there, and I can't believe I got through a whole podcast with an engineer and we didn't talk about AI. We're going to have to talk about that another time, I think. But
absolutely.
I'd just like to wrap up in terms of younger people and younger people interacting with more mature people, shall I say. What kind of advice would you give them in terms of, so if you were working with a Gen Z today, what advice would you give them to get on better with you, to connect better with you as a Gen X?
Talk. I think actually, you're all about speaking and communication, and I think it really is about that. And be willing to, it's important both ways to see the world through a different set of eyes and try and put yourself in their shoes, you can't, and don't try and be them. You know, and we talked about this in a different call. You know, if a word or a phrase has changed because languages evolve and it's used in everyday, you know, conversation, that's fine. But don't try and speak like a Gen Z or a Gen Alpha, because you're going to look stupid, and you want respect both ways. So, you know, try. And if I think it's also about, if you don't understand something both ways, just ask. You know, that fear of, and I think we've probably all done it, you know, the fear of like, I should know this, but I don't, and I don't want to look stupid. But I think it's about asking those questions, you know, seeking to understand. And I think for the coming up, you know, people in younger generations ask those questions. Why do you do it that way? Why? And then be willing to show someone how to do it, you know, like it's the catch a fish analogy. And I think that's really important. I suppose it's about learning, about being open, and about you aren't always right and you don't always need to be right, but you can share that information and improve that, you know, and be willing to have those conversations. And don't fall for the stereotypes. I mean, to come back to where we started, you know, don't, yeah, it's funny and it's, you know, on a reel on Instagram, but is it real? You know, is the real?
I think that's a perfect closing point. I love your concept almost of yearn to learn and then to communicate. Great advice. Gillian, it's been fantastic talking to you. I've learned a huge amount, and it's always great to get different perspectives from different people. So thank you so much indeed for being with us. We've got some details about you in the show notes. So thank you very much indeed for being with me.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Good chat. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for listening and watching. And I'll be back again in a couple of weeks. Bye for now. The Alastair Greener Generationally Speaking podcast was presented by me, Alastair Greener. It was recorded at Granary Studios and produced by James Jones. Please follow us and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. To find out more, visit generationallyspeaking.co.uk.